Es profesor colaborador de la Universidad de Old Dominion, allá en Virginia, exactamente en comunicación y en arte.
Gonzalo, decir que el baneo es un anglicismo, ¿no? Eso es como baneo viene la palabra banned, o sea, la prohibición de TikTok, podemos decir nosotros en español. Pues permítame entonces saludamos al profesor McNutt y le damos las gracias por estar con nosotros hoy aquí en Blu Radio. Professor McNutt, thank you very much for being here with us. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Y la primera pregunta que yo quisiera hacerle, Gonzalo, al profesor McNutt, es ¿cuáles son los riesgos potenciales o las consecuencias a nivel social y cultural de prohibir TikTok en Estados Unidos o en cualquier otra parte del planeta? Professor McNutt, what are the potential social and cultural consequences of banning the platform TikTok in the US or in any other country, now that especially the platform and the social media, it's very popular among young people?
I think this is a really important question. I think one of the things we're seeing about this is sort of like, what are the consequences of losing an app? And we could argue that, oh, it's just, you know, an entertainment source. But for a lot of people, it's multiple things. One, the entrepreneurial impacts. Lots of people run businesses on TikTok in terms of being able to support themselves, whether by making content or kind of marketing and selling products. And we sort of think about that impact as being what's going on here. But I think the other aspect, the cultural aspect you mentioned, is just a sense of connection. TikTok as an app is based on this very algorithmic kind of form where like you see what you feel you want to see, like you shaped it in some way, almost subconsciously. I think a lot of people have developed very strong parasocial connections with other TikTok users, with those communities, and that is a source of kind of support for them in that context. And so I feel like that's the kind of thing where people, normal people who maybe aren't as attuned to the politics of this decision, are kind of thinking, why are you trying to take away this thing that is enriching my life in one way or another? TikTok can also be very negative in one's life, possibly, but I think it's that those people who feel this app as a positive part of their life, kind of wondering what is it exactly that is causing this app so many problems, and why are they sort of taking something away that's really built that connection?
Lucas, por favor, traduzcamos lo que nos responde el profesor a esa pregunta, que cuáles serían las consecuencias culturales y sociales de prohibir una red social como TikTok.
Bueno, Camila, pues lo que nos dice el profesor es que son varios los impactos. Primero, habría un impacto, digamos, como empresarial para quienes usan esto como una fuente de ingresos, ya sea quienes venden cosas a través de la aplicación o, por ejemplo, quienes son influencers. La segunda es que habría un aspecto cultural, un aspecto social, y es que hay gente que usa esta aplicación, pues como usamos todas las redes sociales, para interactuar y hacer relaciones con las otras personas y se generan vínculos. Entonces también aquí habría, digamos, una afectación en esa conexión social y que por supuesto pues también hay impactos negativos, no todo es positivo, pero pues habría que preguntarse exactamente qué es lo que está causando el problema, porque no es toda la aplicación.
A ver, yo quisiera hablar sobre el tema de la seguridad con el profesor, porque es el argumento que da el Senado de los Estados Unidos. Un tema de seguridad nacional, que es una aplicación TikTok peligrosa porque está en manos de China. Professor McNutt, for you, TikTok is a dangerous application?
I wouldn't say that I consider it to be dangerous, but there's no question that like research has shown how the algorithm can dig you deeper into potentially negative thoughts. And so this is the nature of any algorithmic form of media. And that's why, like in general, I think we need to be very cautious about how we approach these platforms, teaching young people in particular about the way we can be skeptical or kind of consider what was being put in front of us. But at the same time, for other people, TikTok has helped their mental health in the same way it can damage others, depending on what it shows them. And I think a lot of the rhetoric around this bill is talking about these potential dangers, both around mental health, but also national security as it relates to the application. But it's sort of a bit of an abstract concept. I think every person has such a distinct personal experience with TikTok. Everybody's TikTok feed is different, that we can't generalize. And I think that's what makes it hard to kind of make this type of kind of very, extensive action of banning an application, or at least threatening to ban an application, or trying to sort of like basically try to divest it from its Chinese ownership. That when this happens, a lot of times what's going on is kind of like, well, wait a minute, but my TikTok isn't like that. My TikTok can't be a security risk. My TikTok is benefiting my life. And I think that makes it harder to make those kind of grand statements. We need to be very sort of, nuanced in how we talk about this. And this conversation, because of the sort of grand totality of it, is maybe not having that nuance.
Camila nos dice, y Gonzalo, el profesor nos dice que es difícil decir si es peligroso o no, porque pues esto tiene muchos matices, pero lo primero es que sí se ha demostrado que todo primero depende del algoritmo y que ese algoritmo en algún momento puede llegar a profundizar en pensamientos y en mostrar contenidos potencialmente negativos, por lo cual, digamos, depende del algoritmo de cada una de las personas. Este proyecto que se está pasando también habla, digamos, no solamente sobre la salud mental y sobre la seguridad personal, sino sobre la seguridad nacional, pero que realmente todo esto se basa en torno al algoritmo, que el decir si TikTok es o no peligroso en general es algo muy abstracto y que tal vez va a depender más bien de cada quien y de lo que la aplicación les está mostrando.
Pero entonces yo quisiera hacer una contrapregunta al profesor sobre la amenaza que puede ser TikTok para la seguridad nacional de los Estados Unidos. Professor, but are you agree with the Senate when they said that TikTok maybe will be a national threat for the security?
I think the best way to understand this is that every single social media app is a security risk. Right? Like, they are collecting our data, and what they're doing with it, who they're selling it to, is a question we should always be asking. I think that the specific concerns around China are very much a political question more than a technological one. And I think that the simple truth of the matter is that there is not yet any evidence to suggest that what they're claiming could happen has happened. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be aware of it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be asking questions. But I think it makes it difficult for this to feel real, particularly for users of the app who are sort of, wondering, well, I know what this app is to me. I know who I am in my politics. The suggestion that China could be using this to influence me doesn't track with my lived experience. And so am I going to suggest that there's no concerns about what the U.S. frames as an adversarial Chinese government having control over social media and the dynamics of Chinese ownership of these companies? No, but I also think that it doesn't, with no evidence to speak of the idea of taking this kind of unilateral action against TikTok, I think is being perceived by users as an overreach based on their own experience.
Bueno, Gonzalo, nos dice el profesor que al hablar de TikTok, pues hay que hablar de todas las redes sociales y que realmente todas las redes sociales están recopilando nuestros datos, están haciendo, digamos, lo que quieran con ellos, así que todas las redes sociales representarían un peligro. Nos dice entonces que él cree que las preocupaciones específicas son más bien en torno a China y no por una cuestión tecnológica, sino que es más bien un asunto político. Dice también que no hay evidencia de que esté sucediendo lo que algunos congresistas afirman en el Congreso, de que actualmente se están filtrando datos al Partido Comunista China o algo así, y que realmente pues esto también depende del uso de cada persona, porque cada persona se mete a la plataforma y dirá, yo uso mi TikTok de esta manera, me aparecen los contenidos que yo quiero ver y pues esto no me está influenciando, digamos, en lo que yo estoy viendo. Así que esto realmente, al no tener evidencia, pues sí sería una extralimitación, digamos, sobre esa medida unilateral hacia TikTok por ser de China.
Yo quisiera saber si el profesor no piensa que prohibir TikTok no sería atacar las ideas y valores que hicieron Estados Unidos, la primer potencia mundial. Si de pronto cancelar TikTok no sería como una suerte de traición a su historia. Professor, banning TikTok wouldn't be a sort of attack to the ideas and values of freedom that made United States great? Wouldn't it be a sort of betrayal of your history and constitution?
Well, I'm Canadian, so I don't have to be too concerned about that. But yes, I think there's no question that the questions of free speech are central here. There's a lot of questions whether this violates First Amendment rights to ban the app. Obviously, their goal is not to ban TikTok, right? They're trying to divest Chinese ownership. They're hoping that this threat can force, ByteDance to separate themselves from the app so that the national security concerns go away. Whether that will happen, I don't think they have any reason to do that. There's no clear incentive to do so. But there's no question this will get caught up in court challenges. This is not a simple process, and there's really no precedent for something kind of being banned in this capacity on a federal level. And you're right, it does seem kind of contradictory to the way the country generally thinks about free speech and these types of values. But I think there's also this idea of national security is an inherently sort of difficult political position to avoid. That I think for politicians in Congress, one of whom, Jeff Jackson, is quite famously on TikTok and has really used TikTok and yet voted in favor of the ban and was very much held accountable on TikTok for that choice, was forced to apologize. And effectively, it's a very difficult political position to kind of be against things that are in support of national security. And so I think that's maybe the disconnect you're seeing, where people obviously believe in free speech, but national security is maybe the justification for limiting that speech. Is that a position that I would personally hold? Probably not, but I can understand why politically that's kind of what's happening in this circumstance.
Bueno, Sebastián, lo primero que nos dice es que no es estadounidense, sino canadiense, entonces que él personalmente no se preocupa mucho por eso, pero sí cree que el tema de la libertad de expresión es un tema central aquí y que muchos efectivamente se están cuestionando si prohibir esa aplicación en Estados Unidos violaría los derechos de la primera enmienda de la Constitución. Pero aquí él se va y nos dice que el objetivo realmente no es en este momento prohibir TikTok como tal, sino obligarlos a deshacerse de la propiedad que está en China y trasladarla a otro lugar, y que con eso esperan pues que esta, digamos, preocupación sobre los objetivos de seguridad nacional desaparezca una vez ya no esté en China. Pero dice, por supuesto, que aquí entra pues todo un tema como de contradicción entre si aquí se estaría violando la primera enmienda, si se estaría, digamos, dejando de un lado esa libertad de expresión que tanto hablan los estadounidenses, pero pues que en este momento sí hay una desconexión entre esas dos cosas.
Yo le quisiera preguntar al profesor McNaught sobre una publicación que hizo hoy el periódico británico The Guardian, donde dice que los adolescentes de los Estados Unidos hoy son más infelices que las personas de otras generaciones, precisamente por las redes sociales, y si esto pues podría usarse como argumento político contra TikTok. Professor McNaught, today The Guardian published an article about young people in social media. They said that adolescents in the U.S. suffer the equivalent of what they call the midlife crisis. They are less happier than other generations, and I want to ask you if this could be used as a political argument to affect TikTok.
I think there's no question, and I think part of the challenge of this situation is we should absolutely be taking how young people are experiencing social media seriously. I talk about this with my students all the time and trying to teach them media literacy and how they respond to these platforms and understand the role they have in their life. But I think the simple truth is that if we want to have a conversation about mental health and social media, it can't just be a conversation about TikTok. It has to be about Instagram. It has to be about Facebook. But the government is not taking any action in those initiatives because it doesn't have that national security kind of framework operating around it. And so I think part of the kind of contradiction of this, and where a lot of the criticism comes from, is the clear sense that, you know, if we actually want to address that problem, a real problem, one we should be addressing, is banning TikTok a justifiable perspective if you're also not trying to impose sanctions and policies on platforms like Facebook and Instagram and Meta that just also happen to be owned in the US. And that's, I think, where if we want to ask ourselves that question, that's a whole other conversation than what this ban and this bill is actually doing. And so I think that's kind of where, again, it's not that we shouldn't be looking at social media seriously, it's that whether this is a sort of justifiable kind of framework for doing so.
Professor Miles McNaught, thank you very much for accepting our interview. It was a great pleasure listening to your arguments about TikTok and that discussion that the U.S. is having right now. Have a great day.
You too.
¿Qué nos dijo Lucas al final a esa pregunta de Cristina, que me parece supremamente pertinente, sobre todo por lo que trae The Guardian el día de hoy, sobre cómo las redes sociales han hecho a nuestros jóvenes menos felices?
Pues Camila, lo que nos dice es que no hay duda de que este también es un tema central y que debemos ver cómo los jóvenes están experimentando e interactuando con las redes sociales y poder comprender el papel que están teniendo en sus vidas. Pero que esta es una conversación que sí hay que tener, pero que no puede ser solamente con TikTok, que hay que ponerla sobre la mesa con todas las redes sociales, con Instagram, con Facebook, pero nos dice que el gobierno no está tomando la iniciativa ni ninguna medida porque estas no tienen el marco de estar amenazando la seguridad nacional, por lo cual nos dice entonces pues que sí hay que hacerlo, pero que en este momento el gobierno no está haciendo absolutamente nada porque solamente se están concentrando en el problema de la seguridad nacional y no en cómo las redes sociales pueden estar impactando la salud mental de los jóvenes.
Sí, y sin duda no es solo TikTok, son todas las redes